Welcome to the World United. Welcome to the World United.
And now I'm going to introduce Michelle Dixon. And Michelle is a trauma release practitioner, body therapist, and mindfulness coach. Michelle got her start in shamanic or tantric de-armoring with Andrew Barnes, learning how the body held onto trauma, both physically and energetically, and how releasing it through touch could not only help release long-held patterns, but also trigger the client into bliss states on the table. Her bodywork beginnings showed her how powerfully we hold on to trauma in our muscles, tissue, and nervous system, our memories and our patterns, and her ability to see how an individual held on to and then released trauma has informed all of her other studies since. She desires to understand more about the body. That desire led to her studies of myofascial massage and craniosacral treatment before stumbling into biodynamic cranial touch with Gloria Melny. And she also wanted to understand how to change the neural pathways that led to negative thinking, chronic worry, low self-esteem, and more. So she became qualified in hypnotherapy, coaching, and neuro-linguistic programming at the Mind Academy. Michelle, at this time, is practice a form of mindfulness that came from decades of studying the contemplative traditions, and it was in the midst of her training that she began to develop her own mindfulness program of 6 core practices. Now she is one of the few experts in trauma release who works with the body, a somatic approach, as well as mind and soul, in order to finally release held trauma and facilitate a happy, healthy, and fulfilling relationship with yourself and others. And her topic today is 6 core practices for peace. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can see me? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'd like to dedicate this talk to all beings who are suffering. And my intention today is really to be a voice for truth in support of the healing and awakening of all beings. So as Deb said, today I'm going to share with you 6 core practices for peace that you can use daily for healing and awakening. But first, I have to give credit to Source for these practices and how I understand them, as well as how I use them. Because although I've been a practitioner for a decade now, this material I'm going to share, really, I consider it a transmission. It comes from a deeper knowing rather than clinical experience alone, although, of course, I've been influenced by my work with clients as well as my own journey of suffering. So suffering, as we all know, is a key aspect of the human condition. And nowhere is this more evident than when you work with trauma professionally, as I do. Yet, as I witness again and again, suffering is also the starting point for awakening. And as we've heard from Delphine and from Robin and their speeches, we all share this experience and we see it every day. It's in times of pain that we're most open to change. It's when we feel we've lost so much, we recognize that we have so little to lose. And so our minds and our souls yearn for something deeper. As Khalil Gibran famously wrote, your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding. One of my most favorite quotations ever. So this is really why, as a practitioner and as a fellow human who suffered, I wanted to have some practices to help me not just release my pain and that of my clients, but also help myself and others towards their experience of awakening. And as I often point out in my work, I think that healing and awakening are really the same thing, because you simply cannot hold on to your suffering if you are identified as the wholeness that you are. But first, what you need to know about me, above all else, as a personality, is that I am very practical. I love to have methods and processes, and I find that my clients really thrive with this, because suffering can feel really chaotic and out of control. So to have something to do when we're feeling in pain is a way of feeling in control. And that feeling itself is very healing, not to mention, of course, the power of certain practices themselves, right? So you can imagine that when I prayed for an approach that I could use not just for emotional pain, but to facilitate awakening and realizing, one's wholeness, I was really delighted when I got 6 core practices, because 6 is so doable, right? It's not 110 practices. It's clear, it's simple. There's 6 practices, I can manage that, right? But of course, nothing is ever that simple. The truth is, as we all know, we always outgrow processes and practices. They become innate. The steps to learning to swim or to ride a bicycle or even to write an essay might at first need to be broken down, but with time, the process becomes embodied. Our bodies remember. We might even do things in a different order or do everything all at once. So in the same way, while there is an order to the 6 core practices for peace, it's also holographic. Each core practice contains the whole. It contains all the practices. And so as you embody these practices, they become part of you and you become part of them. So today is just a short introduction into what it would look like in your life to practice these practices. Maybe as you hold pain close to your heart, as you navigate confusion in this new reality we live in, or maybe as you're simply yearning for the peace that surpasses all understanding. Essentially, I'm sharing a roadmap with you, but as they say in neurolinguistic programming, the map is not the territory. So as I speak, I invite you to open your heart and your mind to your own territory. And what that means is that your own inner life is what really brings these practices to life. So I'm going to begin with the core practice of presence. And I know that we hear a lot about presence. It's very much out there, being here now, being in the moment. But because of the popularity of presence, we can easily mistake a lack of activity for presence, or even think that, being present is a way of inner narration, talking to yourself about what you're doing as you're doing it. But it's not just that. At its core, presence is about allowing. As Rainer Marie Rilke has famously written, another of my most favorite quotations, let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. I love that. So being present as a daily practice is about bringing all of your senses to the moment at hand and allowing everything to be there without censoring your thoughts or your feelings, and grounding that presence deeply in your body. I refer to this as radical honesty. You have to be radically honest with yourself. So why begin here? Why begin with presence? Why practice it? So the point, and this comes from my bodywork experience, I'm sure you'll pick up on, the point of practicing presence is first and foremost about settling the nervous system. You must allow all of your feelings and thoughts if you're going to calm your nervous system out of fight or flight, because the opposite of allowing is holding in a state of vigilance, which is expecting more suffering, expecting more danger, being in resistance, being in contraction. Allowing, on the other hand, although it might feel scary at first, it's about letting go. And in so doing, it communicates to your body and your nervous system that it's safe to feel, it's safe to exist. Because you see, your body and mind must experience safety in order to access peace and ascend and evolve to higher levels of consciousness. So here, presence must be the starting point, and it's one that we can return to again and again. So it's using your senses to observe reality and allow it to be, whilst being radically honest about what you're seeing and experience. I like to think that presence is actually really radical. It's exactly the opposite of what we're expected to do in our world, in our society, with all of the distraction. And it may not be pretty at first, it may be scary, but it's really necessary. So on a daily basis, what it might look like is just taking a moment when your mind is not immersed in work or distraction and looking around at you with your eyes open at the world with all of your senses and noticing what you notice externally and internally. And I do encourage my clients to do this with eyes open and myself because it's a very trauma aware practice. So of course, there'll be thoughts of the future and the past, planning and imagining, and that's okay. But with your eyes open, you can bring yourself back to the present space and continue to observe. It might look like, at first, it might look like asking yourself questions like, who am I now? What am I doing now? What do I notice now, externally and internally? You might be in nature, moving your body, or sitting in stillness, or you might be performing a mundane task like washing up, as long as you're allowing and practicing that radical honesty. Now, at some point, it's important to notice how the present moment sustains you. This is what really settles your nervous system. Notice that you're here, you're safe, you're alive. It's vital for teaching your nervous system what that feels like to be safe, so that then you're able to reach higher states of consciousness and expansion. So as you are being present and allowing, inevitably there'll be emotions. There'll be emotions and feelings that come up. And this is why the second core practice is working with sensation and emotion. Now, emotions, we all know, are tricky beasts because we don't fully understand where they come from, and we tend to assume that they're things that are done to us by external forces or inside of us because of memories of events. And one of the trickiest things about emotion is that if we feel an emotion long enough, it can start to become a habit to feel it. And then the more we feel that emotion, the more likely we are to construct a narrative or a story around it about our identity. This is why working with emotion and sensation is so important, because by directly engaging with your emotion and treating it as a sensation in your body that moves through you rather than happens to you, you can begin to connect to the wholeness that you are. So I like to think of it this way. Your true self is the vastness of all that is. I like to think of it as like being the sky or the ocean. So whatever the case, your vastness is unquestioned. Your human experiences and your emotions move through you just as a cloud passes through the sky or a wave moves through the ocean, but they're not who you are, because you are the ocean. We are the ocean, we are the sky. But often there's so much pain in life that when we experience an emotion, we create an identity out of that emotion, as in, I am the one who is sad. I am the one who is suffering. You know, we begin to experience ourselves as the cloud moving through the sky, or the wave, rather than as the sky and the ocean as the vastness. And then you might begin to create stories like, I'm always suffering because of this thing that happened, because of my lack. I feel this way, I am this way. The power of being able to observe an emotion and experience it as sensation is that we can start to experience it as something transitory that moves through us, but which is not us. So we might experience emotion as, and you can feel into it for yourself as you're practicing this. You might experience it as tightness, or as openness, as warmth, as cold. But allow yourself to feel it in your body as something that is there and then something that is not there. Because as Rainer Marie Rilke said, no feeling lasts, no feeling is final. In any case, it's a truly profound practice to begin to notice your emotions as sensations that move through you. So that leads me to the third core practice, which is releasing false stories of self, because I've already really talked about this. When you begin to notice emotion, after a time, there's a danger of taking the emotion and creating a story of lack, a story about yourself, about your identity, which keeps you apart from your wholeness or causes you not to experience your wholeness. So releasing these false stories of who you are is really profound. And it actually, in my experience, it arises really spontaneously and naturally, just from being able to sit deeply in presence, taking the time to really see your emotions and thoughts as energy moving through you. Now, by the time you've had the experience of feeling your emotions as sensations and releasing that story of limitation, you're already on the path to awakening to the consciousness that you are. But of course, there are always going to be triggers that bring you back until there are no more triggers, right? There are always triggers until they're not, I say, which is why working with triggers is the next core practice. It's the fourth core practice, because it's the biggest opportunity to make peace a default state of being. It's the natural follow-on from releasing those stories of self. I like to think of triggers as the doorways to wholeness. So triggers, and again, this is something we talk about a lot in our world. A trigger is basically an internal circumstance, such as a memory or an external event that causes you to feel, to experience an emotion, which then snowballs into a story or a truth that you believe to be true about yourself or the world. It's actually a wonderful opportunity. And some people I know, I encourage my clients sometimes to keep a trigger journal, just so you can notice every day what's triggered you. And it's like peeling back the layer of the onion, right? You can look at your triggers and you can peel that back to your wholeness regularly. It really causes you to have that deep realization and fuller awareness of what needs to be released in order to experience your next evolution in consciousness. So the next core practice is forgiveness. Now, of course, I could do an entire workshop, an entire speech on forgiveness, because it's so rich, isn't it, with layers and nuances. And we've already spoken about it today. But for the purposes of this short speech, I'll just share the words of Jack Kornfield. Forgiveness is giving up all hope of a better past. I like it, of course, because it's so practical. It's a decision to let go of any notion that something could have gone any differently. It's a release of any agenda that you've had, and it's a decision to move forward. It's also an acceptance that your wholeness remains intact and your worth has never been in question. Of course, forgiveness is never a condoning of harm, but a deep acceptance of what's happened. I actually consider forgiveness to be a really brave act of non-resistance. When you've endured so much, and obviously this is partly speaking to my experience working with clients who've experienced a lot of different kinds of trauma, abuse, etc. When you've endured so much and you let it go and you step into your wholeness and you're prepared to be on that path of, okay, that's done, and now I'm gonna really be my greatest self, you're basically rejecting everything that our society considers dear, right? Blame, litigation, being a victim. It's a brave act. And of course, everyone has their own practice of forgiveness. Everyone has their own means of navigating from unforgiveness to forgiveness. And we do have to find our own path with this. Find a path that feels most powerful and easy for you to work with. But for me, the simplest way to practice forgiveness, and what I do, is I simply acknowledge to myself, okay, this hurt happened, it's done, and now I'm going to move forward in life and embrace the wholeness that I am and live from a place of connection to all that is. In the context of the 6 core practices for peace, forgiveness really becomes a natural next step once you've settled into presence. Once you've seen your emotions as merely energy that moves through you, and then let go of your false stories and embrace the wholeness that you are, you're able to see unforgiveness as really just another story that's not true about yourself, another false story of self that's holding you back from experiencing the fullness that you are. And this is why I teach and I practice the 6 core practices in a particular order, because initially they do flow on, really naturally from one another. Forgiveness is much easier to arrive at once you've done and practiced the other practices. And this leads me to the 6th and final of my core practices, which is gratitude. And I get the feeling that we're all, I know Delphine and Robin, we've all spoken of gratitude. It's so profound, it's so important. I might have something a little bit different to say about it, but it is it is much more easy and more natural to feel gratitude once you've experienced true forgiveness, because when you've let go of your past and your agenda and accepted, where you're at in the present moment and stepped really deeply into your wholeness, it's so much easier to see the beauty all around you. And we know that science is on board with the power of gratitude as a practice. When you get into a habit of feeling grateful, your quality of life improves. And it's a little bit like confirmation bias, right? When you expect to feel grateful, you begin to notice those things in your environment which evoke a feeling of gratitude, right? But it is also true that, until that point, gratitude can feel a little bit like a chore. So I want to just speak to two aspects of gratitude that, we often overlook in our rush to grit our teeth and just feel grateful. And the one aspect is never to pretend to feeling gratitude that you don't feel. So if everyone around you is saying, be gratitude, practice gratitude, and you're just not feeling it, you need to start there. I'll refer back to my presence, the core practice of presence, and my reference to radical honesty. The opposite of being honest with yourself is repression and denial. And that is just terrible for your nervous system and your experience of peace. So be real and start small. If you can only muster a dull acknowledgement that today, at least you had time for breakfast, then start there. If your gratitude cannot soar, beyond living in a dry home on a rainy day, then just sink into that appreciation for being dry and start there. So the second point about gratitude I'd like to make is actually about grace. So grace is a spontaneous experience of knowing your connection to wholeness or source, of momentarily being one. And grace is born on a wave of gratitude. It's suffused with gratitude. Grace is like gratitude squared. And the magical truth is that just as grace begets gratitude, gratitude is like a super highway to the experience of grace. A moment of gratitude can become spontaneously a timeless instance of grace. I know I've had that experience, and many have when you begin to really practice gratitude. So it's worth bearing that in mind, because living from grace is very much living as an awakened being. So these are the 6 core practices that I work with daily: presence, working with emotion and sensation, releasing false stories of self, working with your triggers, forgiveness, and gratitude. But the key I have found in my own spiritual practice and in my work with others is to sit with all of these practices with humility, because humility is really the means by which anyone can deepen their experience of healing and awakening. I'll explain why briefly in conclusion. As humans, no matter our life experience, our education, our training, or the wisdom we each have access to, we all have access to wisdom. But despite all of that, we actually know very little. We don't really know why we're here in this life, what the grand scheme is, how the universe is structured, how consciousness functions. I mean, we might have an inkling of different parts of it, but there'll be many times in our lives when we just don't know or understand what's happening, that existential crisis Robin referred to. We just don't know why. And all we can do in those moments is simply feel and experience and allow. I like to say, and I say this to my kids often, is that when I'm trying to explain the world we live in, right, is that we're all like mice in a maze. We can't see the maze from up high. We can't see what's actually happening. All we can do is be in the maze and see the wall in front of us, or the passageway, or the door that opens to us. And in order to navigate this maze of life, we employ both trial and error. We try something, it works, it doesn't work, and our instinct, our intuition. And for me, humility is really the doorway to hone that instinct so that we're able to navigate from the present moment. When we're able to acknowledge that we don't know, we're then able to return to the present moment again, like with that Buddhist beginner's mind. We're able to return to the present moment from any point in our journey and be like, I don't know, and just sit and notice, simply notice and allow all that's around us. And from there, we can start to notice our emotion and our thoughts and to see that as sensation and energy that moves through us but isn't us. And then we can start to identify, how we've adopted a story about ourselves that's not true. And we can step into our wholeness and return to it again and again, even when we're triggered. We can forgive ourselves and our past and others and sink into a gratitude that leads us to grace. So for me, these 6 core practices are a roadmap, but the territory is yours to discover. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Michelle. You have given us a great deal to consider, and I definitely have some questions and comments for you later. I work with recovering alcoholics. I have for a number of years, and I find the greatest challenge is forgiveness. So we'll talk about that a little and with all of you for whatever insights you may have on that or experience with it. Your certificate is being prepared, so it will be emailed, I promise you. And again, very, very much appreciation for your depth of insights on your subject matter.